In this course, we're going to get authentication up and running on a Nuxt project with Laravel airlock. And the interesting thing about this is we're going to use the auth module to do this, which is what you would typically use with token-based authentication like JSON Web Token authentication. So we're going to go from start to finish, setting up a airlock server, so a Laravel installation with airlock installed, configured and working. We're going to test it out with a very small Vue CLI built project just so we know that it works. Then we're going to come over and we're going to create out a Nuxt project. We're going to go ahead and build out a really simple sign-in page that allows us to enter the credentials that we have stored over on Laravel, authenticate us, all using the auth module and all using Laravel airlock, and then also make additional requests to our API as well. So authenticated API endpoints that rely on us being an authenticated user. So we're going to cover all of this, and then from there you can just start to build up your project. You can kind of forget about authentication, and it's super simple to do with Laravel airlock. So the most important part of this is getting Laravel airlock set up and installed. So let's head over to the next part and get that sorted. So in this part, we're going to go from start to finish to get Laravel airlock installed in a Laravel project, of course, and we are going to configure it properly. And just at the end of this part, we're going to create a really small Vue application to test that this works. So of course the first thing is to have a Laravel project set up. I don't have one set up at the moment, so I'm going to go ahead and do this using Composer Create Project, and I'm going to be using Laravel 7 here. Now that's really important because Laravel 7 comes pre-bundled with cross-origin resource sharing support, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, but that's really important for getting this working because we're going to be sending potentially cross-origin requests over to Laravel from a single page application. So once this is finished, we'll go ahead and open this up in our text editor and we'll get airlock installed and configured. Okay, so that is all downloaded. Let's go into that directory I've just created. What I'm not going to do here is use anything like Laravel Valet or Homestead to get this working. Instead, what I'm going to do is just really simply go ahead and run PHP artisan serve to boot up a local web server with PHP. Now the reason that I'm doing this is when we're testing this, when we're developing locally, we want everything to be on the same domain. So if you're using Laravel airlock to authenticate on a single page application, it's going to need to come from the same domain. So you'll need to serve these both from localhost. You see the IP here is 127.0.0.1, but we're going to just switch that out for localhost. So the first thing I'm going to do is just open this up in the browser just to make sure this is all working. And I'm going to replace this out with localhost just in case we're sending any requests through from here. So that's of course the first stage. The second stage is to get airlock installed. Just before we do that, let's go and just configure out our database because of course we're going to need a user to test this kind of authentication. And I have one just here called Fresh. So what I'm going to do is just switch over some of the credentials that I have over in here. So I'm actually using Postgres here. It doesn't matter if you're using MySQL, this is going to work in exactly the same way. I'm just going to switch over all of this information. So for me, the username is my name and the password is empty. So of course what I can now do is just opening up this in a new tab. So let's go over to that directory again. I'm going to run PHP artisan migrate to migrate the default users table. And while we're here, why don't we just go ahead and run PHP artisan tinker and go ahead and use our factory helper with the app model, user model, sorry, to create out a user. So just so we've got something to play around with. So let's go ahead and add my email address just into here. That's alex@codecourse.com. And let's also add my name in here so we can verify this when we're authenticating. And also, really importantly, a password as well. So for this, I'll just use the bcrypt helper. And let's go ahead and just say I love cats. Great, so that is a user created over in the database. Let's just go over and make sure all of that is in there correctly, and we're pretty much set up to go. You might be implementing this in an existing app, in which case you'll probably have all of this stuff in there already. So the first thing we need to do is talk about the two different uses of Laravel airlock. The first one is API tokens. The next one is SPA, which is single page application authentication. What we're not going to be doing here is issuing any tokens. We're going to completely ignore this section of the documentation because for single page application authentication, this works completely differently to issuing tokens. We do have a course on this, but that's not what we're covering just now. So we're going to head straight down to the SPA authentication section after we've got Laravel airlock installed and configured. So of course, the first thing that we need to do is just pull this in. So let's do a require on this. We're going to publish the configuration. That's really important because we've got a couple of things to configure in there. And that's also going to be really important when you push this to a production environment as well. Of course, locally you're developing on localhost, but when you push this to production, you're going to have domain names, potentially subdomain names, and all that kind of stuff. So let's publish that configuration. So that's good to go. And we're going to go ahead and migrate as well. Now, the migrations in this sense don't really make sense because these are the personal access tokens, which I've just said we're not going to be using. But I'm going to migrate these anyway, just so we have them in there and we don't run into any trouble. So the next thing and the last thing we need to do to really just configure this is add in the ensure front-end requests are stateful middleware to the API section of our kernel. So let's go over to the text editor. Let's open up our HTTP kernel, come down to the API section. Of course, this doesn't apply to web authentication. And let's add that middleware just into there. And of course, we want to pull the full namespace for that in just at the top. So now we pretty much have airlock set up and ready to go. But there are a couple of other things that we need to configure to get this working, and this is, as I've seen around the web, been a massive pain point for some people. So just before we do that, let's head down to the SPA authentication section and just leave that here, and let's go over and start to configure out everything that we need. Now the first thing to note is I'm using Laravel 7 here, as I mentioned earlier. If we come over to the config section, you'll notice that the Laravel course package, which I've pulled in multiple courses, is already included in Laravel 7. So if we just head over to our kernel again, you'll notice this handle course middleware, which you would typically have to pull down as a separate package, but this is now being included by default in Laravel 7. So if you are working with a Laravel installation older than 7, you can still do this, but you'll need to pull in the course package separately. And I've just pulled up a link for that here, so you can go ahead and install that and copy over that middleware. So that's pretty much what you'd need to do if you're not working with Laravel 7. Now, the first thing that we need to configure here are our paths. Now, if you're not aware of cross-origin resource sharing, this basically allows us to control how and what applications or what requests can come into our application. So, for example, the allowed methods that we give, the allowed origins, by default, this is set to an asterisk, so any origin can send a head or a post request to our applications, but you'll probably want to limit this to your production domain or your local domain. So we're going to ignore that stuff for now, but we are going to set the paths just inside of here. Now the paths that we're going to be working with are obviously all of our API routes. That's in there by default, and that's a kind of a given. But we also want to allow cross-origin resource sharing on the login page. The reason being is we're going to be sending a request to the standard login route within Laravel once we've set all this up. This isn't part of our API. This is actually posting through to the same route and using the same controller that you would do on the web. So we don't need to create any new endpoints when we work with Laravel airlock. Now, likewise, we also want to be able to log out as well. So we're also going to go ahead and include log out on our list of cross-origin paths as well. Now finally, and we'll come to this a little bit later because this won't make sense at the moment, but we also have a cross-site request forgery cookie endpoint which comes as part of the airlock package. I'm not going to go into detail of that just in a minute because we're going to be looking at how we work with this and what it actually does, but we're going to want to add that in there as well, so we'll include that now. Now, the other thing that we want to do is set supports credentials to true because we are going ahead and authenticating with our API. So we're going to go ahead and set that value to true. Now, we've not even touched the airlock configuration at the moment. It's actually very simple. There are only 3 keys in here. First is stateful, expiration, and middleware. Now, we're not going to touch either of these because that's completely up to you. But the stateful part of this, the stateful domains part of this, is really important. So you can see here, requests from the following domains or hosts will receive stateful API authentication cookies, e.g. these are the domains that you want to be able to allow your users to authenticate with. Now by default these are, or this is just set to localhost, but if you did have a list of domains that you wanted to include here, you can go ahead and add them to your env file. So if you come down to the end of your env file, you might have localhost and then you might have your actual production domain. But of course, because we're working with env files here, it's likely that you could just overwrite this to your local your production domain. But we'll leave this at localhost for now, because that is of course what we're doing. We're working locally on our machine. Now the next thing that we need to do after we've configured our cross-origin resource sharing stuff and our airlock configuration is come over to our session configuration, and this is incredibly important. Airlock will not work without this change. And what we need to do is we need to come down to the domain section. So let's go all the way down to our domain section. And at the moment, this is set to a default value of null, or whatever is set, of course, in your session domain configuration. Now with this, what we need to do is we need to set this to the same domain that we're sending a request through on our single page application. So from the client to the API, this needs to match, and that's for a very good reason. We'll see this in action later, but the gist of it is that when you are trying to set cookies from an API onto a client, you need the domains to match, or Chrome or whichever other browser that you're working with will probably not set these. So of course what we can either do is come over to our env file and add this in. So let's put this under our session bit just here, and we're going to set this to localhost. And of course if you're working with subdomains, you can do dot and then codecourse.com, so that would work for any subdomain. But of course, because we're working locally here now, we just need the value of localhost. Now, to be honest, that is pretty much it. Within Laravel, a default Laravel installation, we already have a endpoint just in here over on our API routes. So when we get to creating a really simple example view app and sending a request through to here, once we are logged in with the cookies that are set from the API, we should be able to access this information. But really importantly, what we need to do is set this over to auth and airlock. So that will use the airlock middleware to authenticate that based on the cookie that's been set on the client. So at this point, things might be a little bit murky. How are we actually authenticating with this? We've done the setup, but it doesn't seem entirely clear how Laravel actually does this. And let's just hop over to Postman just to show you this endpoint here. Remember, this is the endpoint that we added to our cores settings a little bit earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and send a GET request to this. And this is exactly what we're going to be doing over on our single page application. You can see we get a 204 no content status back, because of course there is no content to this. But what this endpoint does is it will give us back a couple of cookies. So it will give us our cross-site request forgery token cookie, which when we then send over to our login endpoint, we have the X cross-site request forgery token header set. And that means that we can actually send requests over to our API using cross-site request forgery protection, and we don't need to manually send that through or disable cross-site request forgery protection. So again, that might not make sense, but what we're going to do now is set up a really simple Vue.js app to actually validate that authentication works now that we have Laravel airlock set up. So let's go over and quickly set that up now. Okay, so I'm over on the Vue CLI homepage. This is what we're going to be doing just to verify that everything is working. You can do all of this through Postman, but to be honest, it's quite fiddly. And I feel a lot comfortable just really quickly prototyping a Vue project to verify that our authentication works. So if you don't have this installed already, go ahead and run npm install global on Vue CLI, and then come over to the creating a project section. You can run instant prototyping, but this isn't too much trouble to get set up. So let's go over to a new tab, and I'm going to go into the fresh app, and I'm actually going to go ahead and create this in here within the Laravel directory. You wouldn't necessarily do this because you'd probably have it on a completely different repository, but we'll go ahead and do this anyway. So let's just head over to manually select features. I'm going to disable linting just so we don't get annoyed with anything, and we don't want to save this as a future preset. So let's just wait for this to install, go into it, set this up, install Axios, and start sending requests and see if we can authenticate. Okay, so that's all installed. Let's go into the client, and just before I run this app, I'm going to go ahead and do an npm install on Axios just so I can make some HTTP requests over to our client. And remember, when we boot this single page app up, we're going to have the domain. If we just run npm run serve, the domain's going to be localhost. So the really important thing here, and I can't stress this enough, is that the domain here matches our API domain. So both of them domains match, and we have them configured over in our Laravel session configuration. That's very, very important. Okay, so we've got our client set up. Let's just go into our text editor and let's just open this up and just focus on getting this working. So let's pull all this out and let's go over to our main app file. I'm just going to get rid of all of this. We don't really need any of this stuff in here whatsoever. Let's just create out a new script section in here and let's go ahead and just pop something in there like hello. And let's come over and there we go. Great. Okay, so there are a couple of steps to authenticate now that you have airlock set up on your Laravel app. Let's go ahead and import Axios, of course, so we can make some requests. So let's pull this in from the Axios module and let's go ahead and just create a mounted hook inside of here. And in fact, we don't really need that. Let's go ahead and create out a button that we can log in with. That'll do just for now. So let's create out a method in here called login. And this is where we're, of course, going to send them requests. So let's just go and say click prevent, and we'll reference the login method that we've defined, just so we know this is all working. I'm just going to log something out. So let's come over to the browser, open this up, and the network tab here and the application tab in Chrome is going to be really important. You can see I've got a couple of cookies set here, but I'm actually going to get rid of them because typically you wouldn't have them there just from a previous project I was working on. So sure enough, if we click login, that's going to go ahead and sign us in. And now what I can actually do is talk you through how airlock authenticates. So the first thing that we need to do is, the first thing you think you would do is send a request to the login page. So let's make this method asynchronous and let's await on Axios post. And of course, we're just using the full domain here, but typically you'd have that tucked away in config. And let's go ahead and make a post request to login and let's pass some credentials in. Now I registered a user earlier using Tinker. So let's go ahead and send my email address across like so. And let's of course send my password across with this request as well, which was I love cats. Okay, so let's head over to the browser and click login. We actually get 404, that's absolutely fine. That's just because we haven't installed the Laravel UI package. So let's go ahead and just do a composer require here on Laravel/UI. That will bring in, at least with version 7 of Laravel, all of our authentication routes and controllers. So let's go ahead and install this first of all. And let's just run PHP artisan UI just so we can see the help for this. And what we want to do is run PHP artisan UI, and we want just the bootstrap templating. It doesn't really matter what we do here. And we want to pass the auth flag as well. Okay, so now that we've done that, we should actually have that endpoint available. So now I click login. You can see that sure enough, that is no longer a 404 request, but instead we get a cross-site request forgery token mismatch. Now that kind of makes sense because we don't have a cross-site request forgery cookie set that is sending through to our API to verify this. Now one of the fixes for this would of course just be to come over to your verify cross-site request forgery token middleware and just exclude the API altogether. But Laravel airlock handles all of this for us, so there's no point in excluding this because we can actually grab our cross-site request forgery cookie, automatically set it so Axios will go ahead and send this along with every request. So you get the benefit of cross-site request forgery protection on your API. Now what we need to do just before we do anything else, come over to main.js. I'm going to go ahead and import Axios from here. And I'm going to go ahead and set some default, or one default on Axios at least. And that is the with credentials section. So I'm going to say Axios defaults, and I'm going to set with credentials to true. Now we'll see this come into effect a little bit later. It's nothing to do with cross-site request forgery, but let's figure out how we automatically, when we try and authenticate, grab the cross-site request forgery information from Laravel airlock and set it to cookies within our application, so any subsequent requests send that along as well. So what we want to do now, before we send a request, a post request over to login, we want to go ahead and make a get request to, of course, the same domain, but this time we want to send a request to that airlock cross-site request forgery cookie endpoint. Now what this is going to do is it's going to grab the cross-site request forgery cookie, set it within the browser, so when we send a request to log in, that cross-site request forgery cookie is going to be sent along in the header, and therefore the cross-site request forgery error should go. So let's keep an eye on our network tab, click on login, and sure enough, we actually get a 500, but that's a completely separate issue. At least we know now we're not getting a cross-site request forgery issue come back. Now the reason that I've got 500 here is simply because I changed over my env files and I've already started up a server. So I'm going to come over to here, exit out of this, rerun it, and that'll bring my env variables back into the Laravel config. So let's click login, and now we get a 204 no content for our login page. Now, by sending the request to this cross-site request forgery cookie endpoint, what actually happened was, you can see here, it set the cross-site request forgery token and it set the Laravel session as well. So all of this looks pretty good. Now what we can try and do is, after we have signed in, we can send another get request across to /API/user, and we can actually go ahead and dump the result. So let's go ahead and assign this, and let's log on the response data, and let's see what we get back from this. So let's come over to our console, hit login, and it actually looks like we get an error here. This is just one thing that we didn't configure. So if we come over to our env file just here, at the moment we have our session driver set to a file. We actually need to switch this over to cookie. So let's come over to the terminal. Let's cancel this off. Let's run php artisan cache clear just to make sure that that value isn't being saved in there. And let's rerun php artisan serve. So let's give this a refresh on the front end. Let's head over to our network tab, hit login. And now you can see what's happened is the cross-site request forgery cookie endpoint was successful. What that did is it set that cookie that we looked at earlier for the cross-site request forgery token. We then send a request to login, which again gives us 204 no content, but this was successful. That would have now set a different cookie. So this is now our authentication cookie, which allows us on subsequent requests to get back the information about the currently authenticated user. So there's quite a lot of setup here, there's quite a lot of configuration to do, but once you have this in place, what you can now do is send a request to any endpoint with that cookie that's been stored in here, and your users will be authenticated. Now just to demo this out, let's head over to the app.view file that we were working on earlier, and let's get rid of these two requests just here. And why don't we can just re-click that button. But the important thing to note here is we're not doing this again. We've already done that. That's purely just for cross-site request forgery stuff. And we're not re-authenticating. What we are doing is using the pre-existing cookie that's been set, trying to get back this information. So if I now go over and give this a refresh and click login, you can see that I'm still authenticated. I'm authenticated up to the point that I send another request to our API to log us out, or if this cookie expires or is deleted. So I can actually go ahead and send a logout post request to the logout route within Laravel. That's protected by cross-site request forgery, but of course we have our cross-site request forgery token being sent, so that will be successful, and it will invalidate that cookie, and therefore we will no longer be authenticated. But I can just manually get rid of this one just to show you that works. You can see here that we get a 401 unauthorized. So that was quite long, but once you've got to this point and you've tested this out really briefly using a sample Vue.js app, you know that this works now. So you can send this from Vue.js if you're working with Vue, Nuxt if you're working with that Nuxt framework, or anything else that you need to use this for. So now that we have Laravel Airlock up and running and we've tested it with that Vue CLI built project, we can move over to Nuxt, which is of course the subject of this course. And we're actually going to be pairing this with the auth module. So we can still use the auth module within Nuxt if you have used that before. this just works seamlessly. We just need to make a couple of configuration changes. So let's get started. Just get a fresh Nuxt project installed. Let's come down to use npx to create a Nuxt app. And I'm going to come over to the terminal inside of the directory that we're working in, just to keep this all in one place. I'm going to go ahead and create out this client. So let's just run this, wait for this to boot up. And let's go ahead and just call this client. We'll leave the description and the author name. Let's choose npm, and we want to install Tailwind CSS as part of this. So let's choose that as our UI framework. Custom server framework we won't bother with. We will pull in Axios. We'll also pull in .env as well, just in case we want to manage our configuration with .env, which is a good idea. And we won't bother with linting or testing just for now. And of course, we'll just use universal SSR. And let's go ahead and just skip all this. So let's just wait for this to finish. We'll get this running and we can get on with getting our kind of template stuff set up before we start to dive into the actual authentication code. Okay, so that's all done. Let's go into our client directory. Let's run npm run dev and just wait for everything to compile. And let's come over to localhost on port 3000. So that's just booting up our new Nuxt app. So if you cast your mind back to when we were setting airlock up, remember we're accepting authentication requests, and we've also configured cross-origin resource sharing to use localhost. So make sure you are running this on localhost and not 127.0.0.1. Okay, so now that we've got our client set up, let's just make a few changes here. By default, there's quite a lot of scaffolding in here. I'm going to come over to the default layout and get rid of all of these styles. We don't need any of them. We can still keep, of course, our Nuxt template part in there. And let's go over to components, just delete this logo component because we're not going to need that. And let's come over to our index page and just tidy this up as well. So I'm pretty much going to get rid of all of this stuff here and just create out an empty div with home in there. Get rid of our logo import. We don't need that in there at all. And also get rid of all of these styles as well. Of course, we've included Tailwind here, so we can just start to scaffold things out as we need. So this is basically as plain as it gets. So for this, we're going to need a navigation, and I always include a navigation when I'm working with authentication, just testing things out. Because of course, what we want to do is see that the user's authenticated in the navigation bar. So over in components, I'm going to create a global folder, and I'm going to create an appnav.view file. And inside of here, I'm actually going to pull over the template that I already have created. It's very, very straightforward. We've just got a home link, a link that will link through to the user's account area, and of course we'll show the authenticated user's name in here, and also the ability to sign out, sign in, and sign up. So at the moment, if we just come over to index, actually we'll do this over in default. Let's go ahead and import this component. So let's import appnav from, let's use our components global and appnav component, and let's pull that into our components list, and let's pop that just at the top in here. So what we should see is the following. So we've got name, sign in, sign out. Now we can make a couple of changes to our app.css file, which is over in assets, CSS, and Tailwind. Let's go ahead and on the body, just set the background color to gray 200, and let's set a padding of 6. So let's come over and that will just change that over a little bit for us. And there we go. So we've got a little bit of padding. Now, obviously, we won't have all of these navigation items shown in one go. We'll have sign in and sign up shown if we're not authenticated, and we'll have name and sign out shown in if we are authenticated with the name replaced out. So let's go over to our pages section and let's create out a sign in page. So let's create sign in.view. And once again, I'm just going to paste over a template that I've already created. It's just a really simple wrapper with a sign in header and everything that we need to get started with. So if I click in on sign in now, we just end up with the following. So really just a really basic form, enter our email password, hook this up to our API, and we should be good to go. So that's pretty much it. That is our Nuxt project set up with Tailwind. And in the next part, we can look at configuring Axios and Nuxt auth so we can start sending requests for airlock to deal with them on the API. So in this part, we're going to configure Axios, which is incredibly important. If you cast your mind back to when we tested this with this very simple Vue CLI built project, we needed to make sure that we set the with credentials default to true. And we need to figure out how to do that with Axios inside of Nuxt as well. It's incredibly important. And what we'll also do in this part is get the auth module installed and configured as well, so we can start to make requests. So first things first, let's go ahead and just make sure we set Axios up properly. So all of the Axios configuration is inside of nuxt.config.js. We asked for it to be included by default. If it's not included by default, you'd have to go ahead and pull this in manually, but the configuration is just here. So what we want to do is we want to, inside of our env file, set our base URL. So you can see at the moment this is localhost 3000. That's not the URL that we want to make requests to. Our URL is actually localhost 8000. That is our API URL. So really important that we switch that over. Now with Axios, we want all of our requests to be sent with this URL prefix. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the base URL property in here to process.env and then base_URL. And I'm going to go ahead and concatenate on a / here. And what we also want is that with credentials default. Now I made the mistake of going ahead and saying with credentials, thinking that all of the configuration that we add here will be mapped directly over to Axios defaults, but that is not the case. What we actually need to do is pass the credentials property and set that to true, and that will go ahead and set that with defaults to true, with credentials to true. So now we're in a better position to start making Axios requests to our API endpoints once we have Nuxt auth set up. So following on from that then, let's go over to the auth module just here. Let's go over to the setup section and let's go ahead and do an npm install on Nuxt auth. I'm just going to go ahead and cd back into this directory really quickly, just so we can do this nice and fresh. So fresh and client, and let's pull this in, but of course we don't need to pull Axios in because we already have it included. So let's just wait for this to finish and then we'll configure this. Okay, so that's all been pulled in. What we now need to do is just head over to our code and we need to include the Nuxt auth module just inside of there. And then what we can do is we can add an auth property to Nuxt to get this working. You may have worked with Nuxt auth before, but if you don't, this will be a complete guide to working with it. Now we want to essentially replace our local strategy for authentication with the endpoints that we have inside of our app. So the main three things that we can configure are the endpoint that we post through to log in, the endpoint that we post through to log out, and the endpoint that we get to grab user information. So they're the three things that we need to get this working. We need to log in, we of course need to log out at some point, and we need to get the authenticated user's information. Now, by default, we have a local strategy. You can create your own strategies, but we're just going to go ahead and use local. And this needs to be defined under the strategies key. So let's pop local under the strategies key. And then from here, we can configure our endpoints. Now I'm going to leave this empty just for now, but what I am going to do is just at the end of here, so after our endpoints configuration, I'm going to go ahead and set token required to false because we're not using token authentication now, we're using cookie authentication. And we're going to set the token type to false or null or something like that. So that's really important because we're not using something like a JWT token, which I've covered before on codecourse. So we need to set both of them properties in there for this to work. Okay, so now that we've got this set up, we need one last thing, and that is an index.js file inside of our store, so Nuxt can initiate the Vuex store within the framework and make use of auth, because auth uses the Vuex package. So let's go and just close this off. Let's give this a hard refresh, and we look like we have an error here. So let's go ahead and just clear this out and run that. You actually probably saw there that we had some kind of message to tell us to create that index.js file. And let's wait for this to finish and we should be good. So let's give that a refresh, wait for that to load, and it looks good. So now that we have everything configured, we can move over to the next part, start configuring that login endpoint and actually get ourselves authenticated within Nuxt. So let's head over and get that done next. All right, so we're ready to start authenticating. Let's first of all bring up our drawer here so we can look at our console, so we can look at our network. That's really important. Notice at the moment we're getting a 404 not found for the user endpoint. That's simply because we haven't configured this properly yet, but we will be doing that in just a minute. Okay, so let's go over to our sign in page. So over in pages here, Let's go over to the sign in page and let's just hook this up so we can at least submit the form. So first things first, let's add a submit handler to the form and let's call a submit method, and let's hook up our inputs as well. So let's just provide some data in here, and I typically bundle this under a form so it's easier to send along with the request. And of course we have an email and we also have a password as well. So let's switch them out. And for the input here, that's the email address. So let's use vmodel to hook that up to form.email. And let's do the same for the password input here and hook that up to form password. Great. So now we can go ahead and define out our submit method. And let's just log out this form just so we know that that's working. So now I can enter some credentials here. Go ahead and hit sign in and we should get an object back with our email address and our password, which we can send through. Now, the way that nuxt auth works is we would go ahead and set this as a async await. So let's set that to async submit. And we would go ahead and try something, catch an exception, which would be if the authentication process fails, and then you can do whatever you want with that there, e.g. get some validation information back and display it on the form, whatever you want to do. But typically the way that we would do this is use this auth. So this is now a global plugin within Vue, and we would use login with, and we would choose the strategy, which we know is local because we already started to configure that just over here. We haven't quite filled in the endpoints yet. And then we would send the data through. So we would just send data, and in this case, because we have that conveniently wrapped away into form, we just submit that through. So now what I can do is actually start to submit this across. So let's go ahead and enter some information. And sure enough, you can see the login endpoint isn't found. And we're actually sending this to auth/undefined API auth login, which might seem a little bit weird, but that's just because we've not configured it under our endpoints. So the first thing to do is configure this login endpoint. Let's do this now. This is just an object. This will give you the ability to set the URL, which we know is just /login. And also the method as well, which we know is post, so we can choose the way that we send this through as well. Okay, so now that we've switched them over, let's go ahead and sign in with the credentials that we have in the database. And sure enough, we do have a successful request to log in now that we've changed that endpoint over, but we get a 419 unknown status, and that is just because we have a cross-site request forgery token mismatch. Now we already know why that is. We already saw that in the Vue example earlier. We need to make a request prior to signing in to fetch the cross-site request forgery cookie. So inside of here, we're going to go ahead and use axios. So this is again bound to Vue. And we're going to go ahead and make a get request to /airlock and /cross-site request forgery cookie. And that's all we really need to do to start to make requests to endpoints that are protected with cross-site request forgery protection. So let's head over to the network tab again. Let's try and enter my credentials again. And we should see that that works. So it did actually make a successful request. And if we head over to the application and cookies section here, we've got that cross-site request forgery token set in there. Now, what we also have is the authenticated cookie in here as well. So we can actually now start to send requests as an authenticated user. We just need to kind of pull all of this together. So now that we know that we can authenticate properly, what we need to do is update our configuration so we can hit the right endpoint for grabbing the user's information. And we know that that is over in the routes and API file inside of Laravel. So we know that we've got this information here, so we can go ahead and grab that. So over in nuxt config, let's go ahead and just copy this because the structure is very similar. I'm going to go ahead and define the user endpoint, and that is /API/user. The method here is get, and we can also define a property name as well that we extract from the payload that we get back. Now inside of Laravel, all this is doing is just returning to us an object, so we're actually going to set this to false. But if you were using something like Laravel API resources, you could go ahead and provide the key that you want to be looked up, and all of that information will be put into the Vuex store within Nuxt. So now that we've got that, let's also add in a router redirect here. So let's say router replace name index, and once we've successfully signed in, we'll just be moved over to the home page. Okay, so let's go ahead and sign ourselves in with them credentials, and we should be redirected over to the home page. Now technically at the moment we are authenticated. If we head over to Vue DevTools, if you don't already have this, you can go ahead and find it on the Chrome Web Store. Let's go into Vuex and load our state, and you can see here we've got logged in true and the user actually comes back with all of that information. So it's just reading all of that information from our API. And what we can now do is we can update our navigation to reflect the fact that we are actually signed in. So this is pretty straightforward. All we need to do is create a couple of templates in here. So let's go and create a template out here and end that here, because of course we want to show this if we're signed in, and we can do that using a really simple if statement. And the if statement within this particular package is auth logged in, and then we can create another template down here and just end that at the end of here, and we can say v else. So now we should see name and sign out. If we were not authenticated, so if we got rid of all of our cookie information, of course we see sign in and sign up. So I can go ahead and log back in here, and that's going to switch that back over. And what we can now do is we can access the user's information as well. So we can say auth user name or any other properties that you want to show as part of that user, which are now stored inside of the Vuex store. So great, we can refresh the page, we're still signed in, and that's pretty much it. We now have authentication working using Laravel airlock inside of Nuxt. Now I've got a couple of pages we're going to rebuild. We also want to look at signing out as well. So let's head over and look at signing out, and then we'll look at accessing other endpoints within your app that also require authentication, which is pretty straightforward. Now we know at this point from Laravel airlock, when we sign ourselves in, we actually get this authentication cookie, which is being sent and set and sent with every request. So that is how it can continue to authenticate us. But of course, at some point, a user is going to want to sign out of their application, and by doing so, you want to invalidate the session, the user's session, which is all handled for you automatically with airlock. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go and send a request over to the endpoint to sign ourselves out and see what happens. So inside of our navigation, let's go ahead and bring in a script in here, and let's create our method in here to allow us to sign out. So let's go ahead and just call this sign out, pretty straightforward, and we're going to make this async await as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and await on this auth log out, and that's pretty much how we log out using nuxt auth, pretty straightforward. And we can then go ahead and just redirect the user perhaps over to the home page again, like so. So that's as simple as it gets. What we can now do is on the sign out, we can add a click handler to this to sign ourselves out. So let's see what happens, and let's keep an eye on our network tab, click sign out. It looks like it failed, so we get a 404 here, and we could have had a try catch in there, which would be a bit more appropriate, so we're not redirected over if we're not actually signed out. But the point here is we need to go ahead and add in a new endpoint. So again, similar to login and user, we want the logout endpoint here, which within Laravel is just the standard logout route, and of course we want to post through to this. So now we've updated our config, let's just wait for this to rebundle, and then we can try signing ourselves out. So let's click sign out, and sure enough, that sends a successful request over to sign out. It invalidates the token that we previously had. When we give this a refresh, we're still not signed in, but of course what we can do is come back over and we can re-sign ourselves in. So that's pretty much it. We expire the token, and the next time nuxt auth tries to make a request to our user endpoint with that information, of course we're no longer signed in, so all of the store will be updated, and that's pretty much it. So we can now sign in and sign out, which is of course really, really important. Super simple to do with Laravel airlock and nuxt auth. We just needed to explain the reasoning behind how this works. The good news, if you've made it this far, is now any endpoint that you want to protect only for authenticated users, you can just make requests to, because remember, we have that cookie set and being sent with every request that we make. So just to demo this out really, really quickly, just so we can prove that this works, I'm going to go ahead and create another page in here. I'm going to call this account, and this is literally just going to show the user's information. So I'm going to call this index.view, and let's just grab maybe like the home page or something. It doesn't really matter too much. So this page is going to be responsible for sending a request to an API endpoint on our API. So for example, this, which relies on a user being authenticated. This could be anything. It could be a list of users' posts, really just anything you need to do. And it can be any type as well. So it can be a get or a post, but we're just going to demo it out with this endpoint in particular. So what we want to do is show some kind of user information here. So why don't we create out some data within this component, and let's just set the user to null for now. And then what we can do when this is mounted, we're going to go ahead and call maybe a get user method. And with that method, get user, we're going to go ahead and make this async. We're going to use axios, so let's just await on this, to get API/user. I know we're already doing that as part of this, but I'm just using this endpoint to test this out. Now let's assign this to a response variable, and then when that's done, let's go ahead and set the user to the response we get back, and we'll output the user just inside of here. So let's go over to that account page, and sure enough, you can see that without really doing much, that cookie's automatically being sent through, authenticating us, and therefore giving us the ability to extract this information back. So now any endpoints that you create over on your Laravel API, so any routes that you create, you just want to make sure you're using auth airlock. And then say you had a list of users posts, well, you could just go ahead and say user posts, and that would work exactly as you would expect.